Welcome to the, yes, this meeting is being recorded, so if everyone's okay with that, or if they're not, let me know. Welcome to the penultimate panel of the day and of the conference. We'll have 3 speakers today. As always, 20 minutes for the talk, 10 minutes for the questions. I'll warn the speakers when they have 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and then when time's up. If you have any questions, for the listeners, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll tell you then later on. I think that's it. So today, panel 17, pedagogical materials and new speakers. And the first speaker, glad you're here, Jackson Mitchell of Carleton University, who will be talking about learning and teaching Inuktitut. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just get this going. Do you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. All right, so welcome to my presentation on how and why Kaunat learn Inuktitut. I'll come back to that term in a second. This was my thesis project that just recently concluded. And so I thank you again for coming to listen. So for those of you who aren't Canadian, you might not be familiar with this language. So Inuktitut is an indigenous language in Canada. It has approximately 40,000 first language speakers. Many of these live in Inuit Nunangat, which is the traditional homeland of the Inuit people in Canada. This is one specific variety of the Inuit language, which is spoken all the way from Alaska to Greenland. And across Inuit Nunangat, the specific demographic that I'm looking at is the Kaunat, or the non-Inuit people who are living in this region or elsewhere in Canada. But across this region, there's only 485 Kaunat speakers of Inuktitut. And just to give you a sense of where we're looking at, this is the Canadian Arctic. And this is the whole region of Inuit Nunangat. So it's the Canadian archipelago, Arctic archipelago, as well as some of the, a lot of the shoreline of northern Canada. So there was 2 parts to this thesis. There was a motivation side and a resources side. So I was investigating why Kaunat choose to learn Inuktitut as their second language. But today I'm just going to be focusing on the resources side. I'm just going to be looking at that. But this is an important topic because there are many Kaunat who move into Inuit communities and they never learn to speak Inuktitut. However, when Kaunat do learn Inuktitut, it helps them better integrate into the community. It helps them become better service providers, and it helps support Inuit in their language revitalization and language maintenance efforts. So just before I get into the actual discussion of the results and that sort of thing, I just want to go over one distinction. I categorize 2 different types of learning. There's explicit learning and implicit learning. With explicit learning, that's what most people are familiar with. That's where you have a teacher and they have a specific topic they wish to instruct to their students. So they create a lesson plan and they say, we're going to learn about this topic today. So that's very explicit in their learning style. That contrasts with implicit learning, which is much more organic. You typically don't have a teacher that's intentionally teaching a very specific feature. So usually the student will just be learning through natural speech. So they'll just have a conversation with someone and they'll notice a new word they don't know, but they learn what it means from the context. So that would be implicit learning. Second language acquisition researchers mostly agree that learning a language just through explicit means is almost impossible. But there is a bit of a debate as to whether a mixed implicit-explicit approach is more or less effective than a purely implicit method. The thesis that I conducted had 3 research questions, but today I'll only be focusing on the relevant question. What resources do Inuktitut learners have access to, and what resources would they like to have access to? I had 7 participants that I invited to interviews. All of them are Kalunat, or again, they're non-Inuit, who are L2 speakers or second language speakers of Inuktitut. And I just asked them about their experiences learning Inuktitut as a second language. I asked them what resources they had access to, which ones they enjoyed the most, which ones they found effective. And additionally, I asked them what resources they currently thought were missing from the available resources. And so now I get into some of the actual resources that the participants discussed in our interviews. And by far the most important resource to these participants was having access to a proficient speaker. This is regardless of whether they learned in a classroom or outside of the classroom setting. But definitely being able to practice speaking was the most important and the most effective learning activity that these language learners could engage in. Within the classroom, of course, they had access to their teacher, but also even just speaking with other students, being able to practice with classroom activities, that was a really good and effective learning activity for them. Outside the classroom setting, all of the participants found mentors who could guide their language learning. They also had like friends and coworkers who speak Inuktitut that they could communicate with. One of the participants married into an Inuit family, and so he had his family-in-law that he could talk with as well. But in regards to mentors, elders, Inuit elders made for the best mentors. This was because not only are they great language teachers, but they are also a repository of indigenous Inuit knowledge. And so you also get this, in addition to your language training, you also get a lot of cultural and historical information from these elders as well. But something else that was very interesting is that even high proficiency second language learners are also really good language mentors because they're a good source of inspiration. Because if you're thinking of like a beginner second language learner and they meet someone who's already a high proficiency second language learner, they're looking at this person and saying like, or they're thinking like, wow, I can't believe how far they got. Maybe I can do that as well. So it's sort of an aspirational element to that. So even a high proficiency L2 learner can make a really good mentor as well. Coming in second place in terms of the effectiveness and the popularity of different resources, reference grammars and textbooks were definitely really important. This is because obviously even if you have a lot of first language speakers and high proficiency second language speakers that you could talk with, you can't be having conversations all day, every day. It just becomes a little too overwhelming. So in this regard, having access to reference grammars and textbooks was important to allow the students to continue learning Inuktitut on their own time and sort of at their own pace. This was especially important after they had finished any courses that were available. They could just keep studying on their own time. Other written and print materials such as newspapers and novels, they were also used, but not with as much enthusiasm. The reference grammars and textbooks were important, but these participants really enjoyed using them. The other print materials were sort of a mixed bag. Some of the participants were okay with them, but others said, no, I don't like reading those things. Part of the reason for this is because many print materials in Inuktitut are translated from English or French. This can be a little bit distracting for the participants. They found that it's not very good natural Inuktitut. It's very obvious that this isn't something that a first language speaker would say. It's obviously translated from an English or French text. Another resource that the participants had access to was audio. So this would be things like radio, recordings of stories, and music. The older participants who were learning before the internet was available, they mostly used radio as one of their more common resources that was very much available. All of them said that the families that they were living with up in the north, they always had there was a radio in every house, and it was always turned on, and it was very frequently in Inuktitut, so it was a very prevalent resource for them. But one of the participants was really emphasized how important music was to her, and this is with regards to music and language learning. It only really works if there's culturally relevant lyrics, but this participant was very adept at finding this type of music. But it can very much go a long way, because you're learning, again, you're learning the language, but you're also learning about the associated culture. And then, of course, the internet itself is becoming a very important, almost indispensable tool for learning Inuktitut. Many of the previous resources that I have mentioned, such as the textbooks, music, recordings, etc. Most of that is available online nowadays. But the internet's also useful in other ways. So for example, several of the participants who live in the south of Canada have mentors who live in the Arctic. So there's a distance of several thousand kilometers. Telephone lines telephone connections are a little bit spotty sometimes. So a lot of them use Skype or Facebook Messenger or something like that to communicate with their mentors online. So it's becoming a really good communication tool. And then in addition to that, many of the participants use a website called Tusalanga, which is, so if you've ever seen something like Duolingo or something like that, another language learning website, it's very similar. There's different lesson plans, recordings of dialogues, things like that. It's a website totally dedicated to learning and teaching Inuktitut. And even the participants who are older, who have been learning for 50+ years, they have even come back to use this website, because it's very, it's just a very well-designed website that they enjoy. And so now we come to the lack of resources. So everything that I've said up to this point makes it sound like maybe there's tons and tons of resources out there for learning Inuktitut. But unfortunately, the sad reality is that there's actually a huge lack of resources out there. And just to sort of illustrate that point, 2 of the participants have actually gone to the next country over to learn Inuktitut, or the Greenlandic language, because they found that in Inuktitut, there's just not quite enough resources for what they want to learn. So they've gone to a different language variety, which is closely related, but there are some important differences between Greenlandic and Inuktitut. But they've had to go to a different language variety just to get enough resources to continue learning. So that's just an example of how there is this lack of resources available. However, the most common request among these participants was for advanced textbooks. And so many of them commented that there's a fair amount of stuff out there that gets you started. So there's a lot of beginner textbooks. However, once you get to sort of an intermediate stage, you realize that everything that's out there, you're beyond that pretty much. But there's nothing out there that really gets you from the intermediate to the advanced stage. One participant mentioned that there are textbooks out there for first language speakers, but those are a little bit too advanced. So it's not quite very effective because you're lacking the knowledge, the minimum knowledge for those advanced first language textbooks. So there needs to be some sort of bridge between intermediate and advanced. And then another resource that the participants identified would be useful is a standardized proficiency test. The closest that we have right now is the government of Nunavut, one of the regions in Inuit Nunangat. The government has a test that they sometimes run for employees. However, this is not available to the general public. And so this would be something that participants would like to be able to take, regardless of whether they're a government employee or not.
Five more minutes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so they would like to be able to take this proficiency test, regardless of whether they are a government employee or not. For things like if they want to apply for a job, they want to know ahead of time, do I have the language skills in Inuktitut to be able to fulfill the job requirements? So something like that was identified as being very useful. So there's a number of pedagogical implications that come out of this study. So the participants benefited mostly from listening and speaking exercises, whether this was in a classroom setting or not. This kind of contrasts with a lot of the traditional pedagogy, which is about memorizing grammar tables and verb endings and that sort of thing. Those traditional pedagogies were useful for beginners because it helps them build up a conversation, conversational routines, conversation skills, but that's very quickly supplanted by the listening and speaking exercises. And then this sort of comes back to the access to high proficiency L2 speakers and access to first language speakers. Those were having access to a proficient speaker is by far the most important resource because it allows the learners to practice speaking. And then the textbooks and reference grammars are a second, kind of like the second place. But they are very much in a support role. They are there to support the learners understand grammar that they learn implicitly. But the main method of learning does come from practice speaking. And so then just to kind of recap on everything that I mentioned, having access to proficient speakers was the most important resource, followed by textbooks and reference grammars. This sort of reflects the duality of implicit learning versus explicit learning. The participants found that learning implicitly was much more useful than explicit learning, although explicit learning does have its place, especially at the very beginning. The internet has opened many new ways of learning Inuktitut. So things like using Tusalanga, or just being able to communicate with your mentor long distance. And then there are quote unquote enough resources for beginners, but there's a desperate need for advanced learning materials right now to help intermediate speakers attain the high level proficiency. I say enough resources. I say enough resources because it's, you know, I don't want to discount the work that has already been done. However, I think that even beginner resources, we could use a lot more of that in the future. And so I thank you all again for coming to my presentation. And yes, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Jackson, thanks very much. Excellent talk, really interesting. Could you stop sharing perhaps? Or wait, maybe you can just leave it there and I can just, because I can't see the participants so well. But there were two questions, one by Tobias, which was, Or maybe Tobias, you want to ask yourself?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. It's a very important work that you're doing. I found so many things that I felt that I could connect with in your presentation from my own experience working with South Estonian. I don't know if you've heard my presentation yesterday, but it seems that there are things that are similar in this foreign language acquisition of endangered languages, minority languages. So I have two questions that I also encountered with my own work. First of all, is there an official framework for Inuktitut as a foreign language? So something that the Inuktitut themselves have developed, or something that can be used beyond this? You mentioned this state employee test. And secondly, what was the native speakers' reaction to foreigners learning the language? Did it change their own stance on acquiring the language, on learning more of the language? What was their perspective on the outsiders learning Inuktitut?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two very excellent questions. So in answer to your first question, there isn't really an official framework for learning Inuktitut as a foreign language. There's a few different institutions that do teach Inuktitut. I think probably the most I guess influential, for lack of a better term, institution is it's called Pirurvik. So it's sort of it's a college in everything but name. That's in the capital of Nunavut, which is Iqaluit. And so they have a language teaching program that I looked at quite a bit throughout the study. However, I contacted the head of their language department and asked him questions about it, and he said even this Pirurvik, which has sort of the pinnacle of adults acquisition of second language acquisition of Inuktitut, they don't have a specific, like, here's the textbook and you just follow this program. Even that, there wasn't really everything. So that's a very long way of saying no, there's no real framework for learning Inuktitut. With regards to the second question, about the native speakers, for the most part, Inuit were very accepting of the non-Inuit who were learning Inuktitut. Many of them were actually very surprised to learn. It's not a very common language for people to for non-Inuit to learn that language. So they were all the Inuit were very supportive. Something, it's a little bit off topic slightly, but some of the participants who moved up into the north, and they would start speaking Inuktitut with these Inuit, and then the Inuit would kind of stop them and say, you know what, your Inuktitut is better than mine. I think you need to go talk to someone else, because you're beyond my ability to speak. So a lot of Inuit are perhaps embarrassed about, or they're very self-conscious about their Inuktitut. And so there is a little bit of that. If you're familiar with Canadian Indigenous history at all, these are leftover sentiments from the residential schools, which is something I won't get into here, because that's a whole can of worms that I don't want to get into, but you could talk for days and days about that. But there's definitely a lot of shame among the Inuits, or feelings of shame, but they're generally very encouraging of and supportive of non-Inuit who choose to learn.
Tobias, does that answer your question or your questions?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
The second question is from Rita, who asks, which West Greenlandic resources did the participants like or use? And I thought that was really interesting. I never would have thought that, because it reminded me as well of Laos, where they use, and Laos is very similar to Thai, so they use Thai materials instead because it's much cheaper, it's available, and it's cheaper than making their own material. So I thought that was really interesting. Could you tell us then, like, what kind of Greenlandic resources they use?
Definitely.
Can I contextualize before you answer? Because
yes,
Lily and I have been learning Greenlandic for a few years now, and we feel that the resources aren't great. And we were quite surprised to hear that, because Tusalanga, that looks very glossy and it actually explains grammar a bit, but we couldn't find beginners resources. There's that one book with Jensen, so I'd be interested to hear, what is that name of that book?
Yeah, it's like a Grönlandska läsestickor, I think, but it's not a textbook. It's like a graded reader.
Yeah,
it doesn't have any grammar in it. Yeah, so we found, like, we had the opposite experience. We found Tusalanga much better.
or at least glossier. It looks good, but I don't know the experience. So anyway, which West Greenlandic resources did they like? We'd like to know.
Yeah. So I wonder if perhaps, because obviously I was focusing on Inuktitut, I didn't spend too much time on the Greenlandic resources. But I wonder if maybe the difference is that my participants started with Inuktitut, reached intermediate level, and then realized the Inuktitut resources are insufficient, so they went further afield, and then that allowed them to use some of these other resources in Greenlandic.
Yeah, that graded reader might have been one. That's really good for intermediate learners, but I can't imagine. There's that one older book, but it's also for beginners. So maybe that's the one they used. I don't know. I'd be very curious, but we can.
Yeah, that's like, yeah, it's for beginners, and it's really not. Not optimal. But maybe then there were like media, like there's quite a good media, like online media presence in Greenlandic newspapers. So maybe that's what they were using.
It could be that. I know that the two resources that I know for sure that they were using, one of them was it was the speaker of Greenlandic. So the participant was having trouble finding an Inuktitut speaker online. So, but he found someone who spoke Greenlandic. And
okay, that makes sense.
So there is that.
Oh yeah, and there's that website. I'll put it in the chat. But Rogier, you should stop me from speaking. I'm speaking.
Shut up, Rita, please. Anyway, I was wondering myself. I don't really know much about these languages. So how easy is it for somebody learning Inuktitut to use something about Greenlandic? But there is actually a next question by Natalia. Natalia, do you want to ask it yourself? Or I'll just ask it.
Yeah, about the major motivations.
Yes.
Yeah. So major motivations to learn Inuktitut, new speakers who are ethnic Inuit. So I didn't have any ethnic Inuit in the that participated. It was only non-Inuit participants. However, I have looked at a lot of other studies that did involve Inuit who were reclaiming their language. And a lot of it came down to sort of a desire to reconnect with their own culture and their own history. So it's definitely very different motivation compared to the non-Inuit who were learning primarily for communal reasons. So things like, I moved into the community, so I want to learn the language of my neighbors. Definitely very, very different motivation from what I can tell. But again, that wasn't from my own participants, that's from reading other studies.
Thanks. I think we also have to stop here now. So thanks again very much. And yeah, we'd love to know more about this.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. So it's great to be here.
Thanks very much again. Okay, so the next speaker is Steve Hewitt. Just check if you're there. Yes. who will be talking about the problem of neo-speakers in language revitalization, the example of Breton. Steve, the floor's all yours. Steve, I can't hear you.
So we know that Steve tested this in the break room, but there were some glitches. Now we can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now I want to add, this is not going to plan. Okay, now how do I add screen share? Okay, I want to, can you see in the background?
We can see a PDF, yeah. Do you want to make it big? So maybe make it bigger so it hides the icons on the.
Get that out of the way. How's that? Is that better?
Oh yeah, I meant the whole window, but
which window? Of the PDF?
This, yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Okay, is that okay?
But this is great, yeah.
Okay, I wonder if I can get this a bit smaller because I don't need to see you. Okay, so the problem of neo-speakers in language revitalization, the example of Breton. From a peak of over 1 million speakers in 1950, probably over that, Breton, a severely endangered Brythonic Celtic language in Brittany, northwestern France, now has probably under 200,000 speakers, with numerous semi-speakers and rusty speakers, and approximately 0.2, 0.3% literacy among native speakers, as defined by the ability to write a simple personal letter. Practically all natural transmission by native speakers ceased between the 1950s and 1970s, so the great majority of native speakers are now over 60 years old. The language further suffers from an absence of standardization among native speakers. There's considerable dialectal fragmentation. Most speakers know only their own local dialect. There are 3 competing orthographies, with the linguistically least appropriate, ZH, accounting for 85% of users, the vast majority of whom are non-native learners. Language activism, confined largely to learners since the 1920s, began to expand significantly in the 70s and 80s, leading to the establishment of the old Breton D1 immersion schools and the 2 public and private bilingual schools. However, total numbers in these 3 Breton language streams come to less than 3% of school-aged children in Brittany. The dominant language among learners, both children and adults, is an artificial standard with numerous and to native speakers impenetrable neologisms, with strong French phonetics, syntax, and phraseology. While no one factor apart from the lexicon impedes communication between learners and traditional speakers outright, the cumulative effect is to make intercomprehension between the young speakers and native speakers laborious and usually unfeasible in practice. We'll go a bit faster. The rather extreme Breton situation where native Breton speech is now rarely heard in public and is all but inaccessible to learners raises the question as to how feasible it is for a whole cohort to revitalize a language without intensive contact with native speakers. Part of the answer may lie in redesigning teaching materials to make native-like Breton more readily available to learners and in tweaking the written standard to allow more faithful reflection of the living dialects. Now I'm going to, okay, we're going to go down. Okay, so here we have the map of the traditionally they're called the 4 main dialects. It's not actually quite that deep. In any case, you have Leon in the northwest, and that's the basis of standard literary Breton.
Steve, could you enlarge that a bit?
Yeah. Thanks. How's that?
Thanks.
Okay, so here we have the map of the
Excellent, thanks.
Okay, so Leon, then we have a northeast-southwest axis of innovating dialects, which accounts for about 2/3, 3/4 of all speakers, but is not reflected in the literary traditions. And then there's a fourth, very aberrant dialect. Some would even say it's a separate language in the southeast. That's Gwelet or Vante in French. Estimates of percentages of Breton speakers. This comes from 2004. It's roughly accurate. In other words, the language is, in relative terms, is more healthy in the center and the northeast and less so elsewhere. Okay, very important. The percentages of Breton and French speakers. So here we see that this line is Breton speakers, and it starts falling drastically after 1950, and concurrently the number of French-only speakers starts rising. And they crossed at some point in the 1960s, and of course this only goes to 1997, but today it's got that much worse. Okay, I try and you can pick this up. I don't read the whole of this out, but I try to give a rough idea of the speaker demography. 200,000 traditional spontaneous speakers, about next to nil functional literacy in Breton. They don't have any particular orthographical preferences, and their political views are pretty much the same as the French mainstream. Now, of activists, there's quite a big split between what I would call popularizing activists and neologizing activists. And the total number of activists comes to, it's between 10 and 20,000, 90% of whom are learners, so it's very much dominated by learners. And this then means that there are no more than 500 to 1,000 Breton literate native speakers. The vast majority of people who are literate in Breton are learners. And then this divides into, let's say, 10 to 14%. They prefer the Orthography universitaire, and their political views are pretty close to mainstream, plus support for Breton language. Then there's a sort of intermediate, the anti-dialectal people, support for Breton regional autonomy, and then the mainstream ZH, Perlin-Ban orthography, supported by 85 and 90% of users, and they tend to show support for Breton regional autonomy and even independence. Right, so we've talked about these competing orthographies, with the ZH, which is linguistically the least well adapted to Breton. That accounts for 85 to 90% of people. Okay, going on. Basically, three possible approaches to orthography design: mononomic or monodialectal. The problem of the choice of dialect-based, Breton speakers will not accept the imposition of a single dialect. No one wants to accept that. Historically, there have been three separate norms for KLT, so that's Northwesterns, well, sent everywhere except the Southeast, and then Southeast has always been separate. Orthography universitaire has parallel systems for Leon and Gwelet, but the central dialects are left out. Then there's a binomic bidialectal system. ZH is basically based on Leon in the Northwest, but some ZH conventions are meant to include Gwelet in the Southeast. And again, no account is taken in that solution of the majority innovating central dialects. And then the third choice is a polynomic superdialectal umbrella system. And one of the questions there is the amount of variation to be allowed. Untitled was the first attempt at a true superdialectal system, and my etymological orthography goes considerably further in that direction. You can pick this up. Here are some of the main problems of Breton dialectology, which need to be catered to by a good orthography. So this is, let me just make this a little smaller, it's a bit easier to see. Okay, this concerns the pronunciation, interlocalic pronunciation of Old Breton S. Here is intervocalic pronunciation of Old Breton V. So it's written Z in most orthographies, but actually only pronounced Z in the Northwest. Here is the famous ZH, which goes back to Old Breton Th, and that's pronounced Z everywhere and H in the Southeast. There's an old difference between intervocalic W and intervocalic V, and only the etymological and dialectal variants. There's also the traditional Vante also shows this. Okay, so here, let's go back to this. We have etymological, there's S, Z, and ZH, which correspond to different dialect reflexes, but the S and the Z variants are completely confused in the two main orthographies, ZH and Orthography Universitaire. Again, the difference between intervocalic W and intervocalic V are also confused in the two main orthographies. Here's some more, and then another diphthong. Palatalization of finals in plurals. And this is interesting, where we have the ZH ignores the palatalization to go with the Southeast. So they impose something which is not natural to the majority of speakers. And then this is another interesting thing. This is if I saw her. So it's in Breton, it's a conditional. So you have the main version is Mawelfen Leich, written as such in etymological. ZH asks people to write if her I would see, which absolutely nobody says today. It's almost completely not understood. Orthography Universitaire is pretty close to what people say in the mainstream area. And then Vante has a completely different older construction, which is and if her I would see. But this shows the difficulty of bridging the gap between the mainstream KLT dialects, and this is a big syntactic problem with the southeastern dialects. Now, one of the reasons that the ZH orthography, I think, they impose this rather strange thing that no one actually says, is that it is isomorphic with French. Si je la voyais, I'm trying to get that up. Si je la voyais. So it corresponds to what people think of in French, but it's not actually said very much. It's not even understood. There are other morphological problems. There's no agreement on forms for the verb to be. You have, we have, they have. It's all over the place. There's no one form that sticks out and is the obvious choice for a standard. Even pronouns, we, they, there's no obvious choice. My, our, there's no obvious choice. There's no obvious choice for the future plural. So this has led to a situation where news broadcasters sometimes overuse the passive in order to avoid using uncertain plural forms. It's not a real solution. So instead of a basante de, or ne, something, nobody knows, manifeste dir, the programmers demonstrated yesterday, they say things like manifested zu bieten dir keine basante. It was demonstrated yesterday by the farmers, just to get out of having to use a form of the verb to have, which might not be understood everywhere. Standard language and dialects, again, I think you can pick this up. The main point here is that the twin modern standards based on peripheral conservative dialects, and they disregard the mainstream northeast, southwest innovating dialects. No native speakers speak standard. At best, if they're literate, which is very rare, they speak their own dialect clearly, occasionally adopting more standard morphology. Decline of traditional Breton, we saw that graph with the the numbers falling off drastically since 1950. So in 1906, we had 60% Breton monoglots in Lower Brittany, last real monoglots 1980s, 1950s to 70s, bilingual conversations very common between grandparents and grandchildren. And Kostowick, 2002, found that the last exchanges in Breton were not within the family or at work, but rather with childhood friends. Now, learners' motivation proportions, I think it's first because they have members of, people have members of their, older members of the family that speak Breton, and only second comes political commitment or Breton activism. Many budding learners drop out when they realize that standard Breton does not enable them to communicate with
five more minutes, Steve.
Okay.
Thanks.
A little bit faster. So Neo-Breton phonetics entirely relied on French, morphology, conservative syntax, either French or hypercorrect. Lexicon, big problem with the lexicon, maximum avoidance of French loanwords. Native words used improperly, so traditional disons like in the word Gudenat, you've got yourself in quite a tangle there, and then that word is used in standard Breton for problems, but to native speakers it sounds like I have tangles. You might say I have problems. Phraseology of Neo-Breton, thoroughly French, and the cumulative effect is it largely impedes traditional Neo-communication, near incomprehension in both directions. Traditional speakers, ashamed of speaking Breton, etc. You can pick up this list and go through it later on. So I want to give you a sample of the two sides. And then Neo speakers, you have their attitudes here. This is a dialogue de sourds, dialogue of the deaf talking past each other with really very little agreement. Okay, so sample of learners' Breton, which we'll listen to in a second, clearly influenced by the ZH orthography, and I won't go through all of this, but you can go through it. See, one of the problems is that the ZH orthography often suggests voiceless stops at the end of words, which is impossible in spoken Breton. So that means that native speakers don't even recognize where the word boundaries are. Now I'm going to see if I can pick this up and play a little bit to you. Can you see the?
Yes.
Can you hear?
Not really.
Yeah, the audio is really tricky here in Zoom because you have to activate these settings. So probably so that we can have time for questions, it's good to put the links in the chat and then people can explore them if they are available.
They can explore it from the chat, but I'm just, we did get this working properly. There's something I have to do.
Yeah, it's you go up to the options and then you activate the audio there. So it is a bit tricky. So
can I try it again?
yeah, it's a little bit difficult to explain. So I think it'll be more fruitful if we have a discussion and then the links are in the chat in the meantime. So
the other one.
You can try, but it's like the access, it doesn't have access to them, the Zoom. So
2 minutes still.
Okay, I'm trying to get back so that I can see you. Okay.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, it's really tricky. It's not,
Yeah.
it should be easier, but they don't make it easy here in Zoom. So.
No.
Rogier?
Yeah, Steve, thanks. Was that the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much. There's a question here, just one sec. Michael.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So my question is, the title of the paper posits new speakers of Breton as a problem. Are new speakers really responsible for the perceived failings of the revitalization process, as this paper suggests? Are they not the logical outcome of language revitalization?
If you'll allow me to answer, can I answer now?
Yes.
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I never said that new speakers were a problem. I said that the situation is a problem. You can't convince me that a whole cohort of people who can't even communicate with native speakers, apart from just passing the time of day, hello, how are you? I mean, everyone can do that, but there really is no communication across the divide. So the situation, this is not Breton you are revitalizing, it's something else. It's not the new speakers' fault, it's the fault of their teachers. I would say that about 90% of the people teaching Breton in Brittany should not be teaching it because they just don't know the language properly. That's where the problem lies.
Could I ask where you get your figures from? 90% of teachers, where do you get this figure from?
Well, because I've spent about 40 years working in Brittany, and that's my, you know, we talk amongst ourselves, everyone agrees that the figures are something like that. There's about, in the language movement, about 90% of people cannot carry on a nuanced conversation, everyday conversation with native speakers.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? I wanted to ask myself, sorry, Nicholas. I was reminded of Romansh Grishun, this pan-regional version of Romansh. Have there been attempts? I didn't catch that. Maybe if you talked about something like that, but have there been attempts like that to have a pan-regional variety of Breton?
Well, I would say that the mainstream language activists would say that that's what they're doing. The problem is it doesn't work, and as in the Romansh Grishun, I mean, they're coming away from it now because it's just too far from what everybody speaks. It really has been a disaster. Now, my personal take as a linguist is, I used the word tweaking in the beginning, and I think all you need to do is to tweak the standard somewhat to come up with a fairly workable standard, which is much closer to what most people speak. That is linguistically possible in Breton. I've looked at the Romansh Grishun situation a little bit, and I really can't see, any solution. I'm not surprised that it's failed more or less, except for iconic purposes.
I suppose really often then this new variety, instead of replacing the others or functioning for everyone, is just an extra variety, and just get a, it's a bit like with new orthographies. Yes, except what's happening in Brittany is that there's no transmission of the natural variety anymore. There are almost no native speakers under 50. Most of them are over 60. So the end is in sight. And the sort of standard neo variety is what's taking over. And I think I didn't manage to say at the end, but it's almost as if 10-20,000 people were propagating Israeli Hebrew when there were 10 times as many native speakers still of classical biblical Hebrew.
That's a fairly good analogy of what the situation is. But at the same time, we all recognize that there is not going to be any community continuation of traditional native-like varieties.
Yeah, I think it's obvious it's a problem situation, not clear that there's any solution to it, but maybe you're misrepresenting what the situation was like before the collapse of native speakers in the 1950s and 1960s. In that people tend to see the competence that people had before then was how they spoke. But what they had, as well as how they spoke, was an ability to understand people speaking other dialects. And so that when the new speakers come along and try to learn Breton, they only get taught one version rather than a sort of polydialectal approach, which people de facto had achieved in the past.
I think you're not quite tracking. The standard version isn't a version of anything that ever existed. It's something that's been concocted mainly by non-native speakers, and it's sort of gelled outside of all contact with native speakers.
Yeah, but the fact that it's a single version is the falsity. I mean, in Irish, for example, even now there are three major differences, dialects of Irish, and if you learn them as an outsider, you're continually being frustrated by being taught three competing versions at the same time. But ultimately, something like that has to be achieved.
Yes, all I'm saying is just get back to what people actually speak, and the obvious solution is to concentrate on these northeast southwest dialects, which are not unfortunately historically not catered to by any standard form. That's the big problem, because intercomprehension is very easy along the northeast southwest axis, and even going up into the northwest and down into the southeast. So from a linguistic point of view, that is the obvious solution. But for historic reasons, that was never written. It was the two peripheral varieties that came to be written. So it's the whole situation is rather fraught, and I don't want to blame neo-speakers, but I do blame their teachers who don't actually learn properly.
It's quite difficult to get on board if you're not a linguist, I suppose.
There's a question in the chat by Eda Derhemi, which is, can it be called revitalization?
Yes, well, that's a little English spoken among EU institutions, or this is sort of globish. And having worked in the United Nations system for 23 years, I very much sympathize with that. There is something of that, anyway, it's a great pity, and the numbers are still there. I mean, the proficient neo-Breton activists, 10, 20,000, not much more than that. Someone has calculated that some 60,000 people had some contact, but as I said, a lot of these people drop out and they never learn the language proficiently. Proficient users of sort of standard Neo-Breton around 10 to 20,000, something like that. And we still have 200,000 proficient native speakers, but they're all over 60.
There's time for perhaps one more question. And Chris asks, would it be fair to say that the situation of Breton is not as hopeless as with Cornish, but it faces even bigger obstacles than Cornish?
Well, the wonderful thing about Cornish is that you can't go wrong because they're coming from nothing. You know, the language was lost 200 years ago. There haven't been any real native speakers for 200 years, whereas Breton is still in the midst of a catastrophic decline. It's now coming to the end of that process. I came to know Brittany in the early 1970s when it was in the middle of this catastrophic decline. And it leaves very few, I mean, everyone in Brittany is traumatized by the situation, one way or another. The majority of people turn their back on it because it's too difficult. Other people, you know, but everyone is affected one way or another. You've gone from a situation where early 1900s, majority of monoglots in Breton-speaking Brittany, and today in Breton-speaking Brittany, it's spoken actively. Maybe 20% have some knowledge, and it's perhaps used as an everyday language by just over 10%, something like that. So from 60% monoglots to only 10% users in 100 years, it's quite catastrophic.
I'll have to stop you here now. Steve, thanks very much for this really fascinating overview. I wanted to ask another question, but I'll ask you later in the chat room also about the political views of the speakers. I thought that was really interesting to align those and so. Yeah. But we'll have to stop. Thanks very much again, and we can talk. We can continue in the chat room, in the break room later as well.
Yeah, I'll be here.
Thanks very much.
Right.
Our next speaker then, Javier, I'll just check if you're here.
I am.
You are, excellent. Okay, so the next speaker, Javier Domingo from the Université de Montréal, with as the topic, the struggle for collaboration, chasing Tehuelche, a language from Patagonia.
Oh, not again. Hello. Hello, everybody, and thank you. I had a problem with sharing my screen. I tried to solve it, and I hope it's solved right now. Let's see. Is it okay? Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Oh, yes, my name is Javier Domingo from the Université de Montréal, and I will talk about the Tehuelche language from Patagonia. I would start by giving a very, very quick context of the language. We're talking about Patagonian language, which is a language that was first documented by Pigafetta, Antonio Pigafetta, who was a chronicle of the Magellan's expedition in 1521. He encountered a group of people who he called them Patagonians. No? And people have been known as Patagonians ever since. Only recently they have been called Tehuelche from outsiders. Well, Patagonia was never conquered by any other European power, but Argentina and Chile invaded Patagonia around 120 years ago, and they have switched to Spanish massively in 1920s, 1930s. In the imaginary from both countries, Chile and Argentina, Patagonians or Tehuelche, they are extinguished like dinosaurs. They're not there anymore. And after the campaign which conquered Patagonia, they are said to be disappeared. So only very recently there has been a re-emergence of many indigenous communities all through South America, but especially in Argentina, which is a country that likes to consider itself white. But now there are not only the Tehuelches, but many other indigenous people are re-emerging, as we call it. Well, the language has not been described from this time, from Magellan, it was never documented. Only in 1966 and 67, Jorge Suarez, an Argentinian linguist, very well known in Mexico, together with his first wife, Emma Gregores, they made a language documentation, which consisted mainly in oral texts, but he never worked with those texts. Actually, because he divorced from her first wife, and they decided not to continue the work. And 20 or 30 years later, another Argentinian linguist, Ana Fernández Garay, made a formal description with a classical Boas trilogy, a dictionary, a corpus of texts, and a grammar. In 2010, a group of anthropologists, two anthropologists actually, they worked with a very small group of Tehuelche who were living in a reservation. They're not called reservations anymore in Argentina, they're called just territories. But back then it was a reservation. And they encountered a group of people who expressed that they were concerned about the language because only very, very few elders spoke the language by then. And they decided to implement a reclamation or revitalization program. This is the anthropologist in charge. And the state, the province of Santa Cruz, it started a revitalization program of this language. By then, by 2010, the only speaker left was Dora Manchado, who was regarded as the last speaker of Tehuelche. Well, this is a context. And I was interested in this. Myself, I was born in Patagonia, and I was interested in this movement. So I went there to see what was it about. I encountered that actually this was the revitalization movement at all. It was Dora Manchado together with anthropologists, and this is fake. This is just the president of is the minister of education of the province who went there to get a photo, a picture for the press to be published, but actually there was no one there. Sometimes there was only one or two people coming to the lessons which were held in an office of the Ministry of Education. So when I went there, I saw that and I got involved in this movement. And this is not the first presentation I make on my own work on Tehuelche and the documentation and all the trouble that we had with it. But this one, I'm going to make a bit of catharsis. I'm going to show many things that aren't quite well as we normally show them. I don't have big conclusions about that, but it's something that I would really like to insist on, and I question myself every day, and I try to get the best out of it. When I went there were no materials, no teaching materials. I were working with what Dora Manchado could know, what could remember, but her work was more to pronounce a language that they already had established from the linguists that had working with the language before. But this language was not, first of all, it was not the language that Dora Manchado spoke. She was regarded as a bad speaker, although she learned Spanish only when she was 16 or 17 years old. And then it was not the language that people wanted to learn. They wanted to learn something like, hello, happy birthday, thank you, I love you. And, but those were not the linguistic uses that were reflected on the texts. So I started building, I've tried to forget about writing. I tried to forget about formal teaching, forget about your cahier, how do you say, your notebook. Let's talk, let's have fun. And we built together with the people who attended those lessons, who were only 2 or 3, which this I normally never say that there are actually 2 or 3 people that attend the lessons, no? But it's true, there are only 2 or 3 people that attend the lessons. And we built these beautiful materials. One of them knows how to draw very well. So we made a bingo show, which is a bingo when we recorded Dora's saying the voice of the animals, the names of the animals. And then we put them on random play on the computer, and we heard those names, and we had to pick up the right animal. And we built this to learn the colors, because people are obsessed about animals and about colors. So I don't know if you know the Uno card game. So when you have to say, the color of the card you have on your hand, but you may lie. So we built this game, which is very similar, to learn the colors. But even though we have 2 problems with them, it took us a lot of time, but they got lost, because I worked for the state, and the state in the office, they got lost, and nobody knows where these materials are. And the second thing is that children, especially, they love these games, but after playing hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of this game, they still didn't know the colors, and they still didn't know the animals. So we had problems with the orthography. They wanted to write, and the orthography was chosen by Arma Fernandez-Garay, the linguist who worked with the language. But people, for instance, this is the way you say hello, why English? But in Argentina, is read Washingish or Washingish. So they pronounced it that way. And we try to change that. Well, we just put a Latin I, Wayingish. And this is the name of the language, Aoniko Ayen. And they would say Aoniko Ashin. So even the name of the language, they could say it wrong. So we changed it and we made it easier. So orthography shouldn't be a problem. That's what the decision that we took. No, the language has many adjectives, etc. But if they saw the apostrophe, they would ignore it. They just didn't read it. So by putting it double, it made it stronger, as they said. Okay, this caused a very big problem with the linguist that made the original alphabet, because she said that I was taking my own decisions together with them or the 2 or 3 people that attended the lessons. So she got mad and she stopped us helping us. And we tried to build the language in a very beautiful way, as you may see. Children, these are the sons and daughters of those 2 or 3 people who attend the lessons. They literally built the letters with their hands. And we put them together with some drawings. And we built an alphabet. And I even made a video about it. It has sounds, but you won't hear it, I think. Well, this took me hours and hours and hours and hours of work, as you may know. And it's very difficult for them to understand the difference between an anthropologist, which I am, a teacher, which I am not, and a graphic designer, which I am not, or someone who works with animation in computers, which I am not. I had to learn all this, and I guess many people here know what I'm talking about. We have to, of course, in some way, I know more than them, and actually I did it, but it was useless. This video, nobody has it now. We sent it by telephone or by WhatsApp or by email. I asked last week, nobody has it. And this graphical edition, we wanted the state to publish it, and it didn't. And this was very, very frustrating. The first time that they ever wrote something, that they ever used this alphabet, it was with me. They made me a t-shirt which says Nakalkade, which means thank you, white man. And they made, I think I have it here, this mug, Nakalkade, with the face of Dora Manchado. It's nice, it's cute, but okay, the alphabet was made for them. And the first time that they use it, yes, it's here. And the first time they use it, it was for me. So that was very frustrating for me again. With this alphabet, we made 2 stories and new materials, and these materials are gone. Nobody knows where they are. Okay, I have them, and I can make them again, but it meant a lot of work. We recorded 2 stories with Dora Manchado, and then we worked, I think about a month, but really a month, 30 days, we're doing these materials. Nobody knows where they are. Another use of the alphabet, actually the language is displayed on the linguistic landscape of Patagonia for tourists and for things like names of schools, of names of some public buildings. And even if I insisted in the idea that you may write your language the way you want, and it was never written before, for them it was having an alphabet. It meant that they could now be prescriptive. So they would send me messages or call me or send me pictures saying, look, I found that I saw something written in the Tehuelche, but it's wrong. Should we tell them that it's wrong? And I never know if maybe it's okay that the language has been shown. The language has a display, because you then may claim that you belong from there. And they didn't want to insist on prescriptions, but that's the way people understand it. Another thing that I found that probably many of you were in the same situation, that I became a Tehuelche governess. My work, the parents, they thought that I had to go to sometimes to the place where they lived, which it was never in the same town. So I traveled around the province and I stayed 3 or 4 days with different small groups, and I had to take care of children. And taking care of children meant everything. Like you have to go shopping with them, you have to take them to school, and my job was to learn Tehuelche. But there was no identification of it. There's still many of them, they didn't know that the word Tehuelche, or they didn't care about the language because it was an indigenous language or because it wasn't the language of their families. They just wanted to learn Tehuelche because it was taught by me, who was someone who came from Italy and who had bonbons or chocolates from Italian chocolates or Italian candy for them. And many of them, they even thought that they were learning Italian instead of Tehuelche, which was, of course, again, very frustrating. I even went to the reservation. This is a picture of the reservation. I was not there in that very moment, but that's the attitude we had. Children, they didn't want to learn language, and we were forced to teach them because their parents wanted them to, or the state wanted them to. But as you may see, it seems like they're taking a picture, it seems like someone that's robbing a bank. No? They just didn't want to know anything about Tehuelche. And of course, they didn't have the chance of learning Tehuelche. So that's, again, another struggle. No? Or to which point should we force them, or should we insist, or should we tell them how nice it is? But the fact is, it's not nice. It's hard for them to learn the language. And everything they want is to get away from the reservation. So again, okay, it's very easy for me to say that the Tehuelche is a very nice language and it's worth learning it, but for them it was not the same thing. And besides, then after my lesson, I left and I went back to the city, and they had to stay there sometimes without gas in winter, without water, and etc., etc. Another issue it still is very complicated for me is that I feel that I'm a living dictionary. Even if I built dictionaries for them and I made glossaries for them and I send them by the post, I feel that my telephone number is like 1-800 Tehuelche. So constantly they're asking, Javier, how do you say this? How do you say this? How do you say this? And I answer, of course, but it means a lot, and sometimes it's not very easy to translate what they want. Like, how do you say happy birthday, or happy Christmas, or Merry Christmas? And if I explain that we don't have a way of saying Merry Christmas,
Javier,
yes,
5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. It's very frustrating for them. Oh, they have an internet site. I will put it on the chat afterwards, but it's also very complicated for them to know what to put and what not to put. I will skip this, but then we made, thanks to the LDP of SOAS, we made a very nice linguistic documentation program together with the last speaker. Unfortunately, she passed away only 3 months after we finished the documentation. We tried to document things, linguistic issues that people would really use, like telling stories or dressing up or eating together or cooking together. But the fact is that people, they don't use those documentation videos. They just don't watch them. I know because I can see the site and I have them on my own site, and they just don't watch them. It's very hard for them to watch. And what they really want and what they really need is exactly what Dora Manchado needed. There's someone to speak with. Dora Manchado couldn't speak her own language because she had no one to speak it with. And they need someone to interact with them. They don't want materials. They don't need materials because they don't know what to do with them. They need interaction, they need recognition, and they need to participate in action. We had many problems doing that documentation. The documentation is very nice, but actually you don't see everything what was behind. And it's okay because it meant a lot of pain, a lot of money, a lot of work, and many things that went wrong. For instance, we wanted the community to collaborate with us, and they didn't. It was always me, my assistants, and Dora Manchado, because she didn't want to speak with the other ones. Why? Because I came with food, I came with money, I cooked, I arranged her and cleaned the house, and the others didn't. So there were problems again with this with this division of people from outside from the community or inside the community. But in Spanish, they say that the hair jumps where you never expected it to jump. And it's true. Sometimes very nice things are happening around the language, but we can never target them. No? For instance, this is a way that they show, they attend to some community meetings or the birthday of the town or events like that. And they show things like this with the name in Tehuelche, even toilet paper. And there's always, the very nice thing about this is that there's always a Tehuelche behind that table that it's claiming an identity, no? But another problem that we have is with the press. The press always calls me.
2 more minutes.
Thank you. The press calls me because they want to publish something about Tehuelche. And I say, for instance, please don't say it was the last speaker of Tehuelche. There are new speakers trying to learn the language, but they won't listen. And as you see, they write about my name, but they still say the last speaker. Or they ask for me stupid things like, please, how do you say, not the community, people from outside, how do you say mujer del viento, which means something like the woman of the wind or the wind's woman? What does it mean in Spanish? I don't know. But people want to know those things. They want to know how to say, this is an email that I received. No, they want to know how to say hope or how to say liberty or freedom in Tehuelche, which there are of course words that we don't know, but that's what people ask for. They want to name streets about it with this. Another this struggle, very important struggle that we have right now is that in the Parque Nacional Nahuel Huapi, with the national park in the place where I was born, there are problems with the Mapuches. Mapuche people are occupying land, and white people in Argentina, they're against this. Why they're against? Because they sustain the idea that actually Patagonia was occupied by Tehuelches and not by Mapuches. Okay, this is the city where I was born. If we may have people dressed like this, you may imagine that I can't say that Mapuche don't belong to the, as a white man who was born there, I can't say that Mapuche don't belong to the Parque Nacional. It doesn't have any sense. But actually, that's what not people want to learn. And we do have problems between Tehuelches and Mapuches, because the Tehuelche people, they feel that they are displaced by the Mapuche. But I can't say that because I'm an anthropologist and I'm supposed to care for all indigenous people. And to conclude, we're working now with Zoom because they asked me, in pandemics, everybody's working by Zoom, and they asked me to learn the language. But I still have many problems with that because I have to be there every time. But when I get there to the Zoom meeting, there's no one there. They always come like half an hour late at least. And many of them, they just don't come. But I can't do that. No? We are trying to make a book. This is a very nice project. I'm very proud of it because we find that when we do something, instead of just learning the language, people, the participants are very much engaged. And we try to make a book that they want to sell, but not because of they want to get money.
I'll have to stop you really soon, so if you can wrap up.
With this. And the problem with this is that there are many people who are not participating and they're getting angry, and now they're trying to stop us from to publishing the book. So, okay, this was it. I want to leave these conclusions that we have many problems of being the expert, being the linguist from outside, and there's a struggle for collaboration that we can't always find the solution. And that was it. Thank you.
Javier, thanks very much for a really excellent talk. I also really like the thing you mentioned about orthography causing sort of problems, like that people start to say like, oh, well, that's wrong, or brilliant. Thanks. There's a couple of questions already. The first one is from Serena, who asks, I would like to know, what language do kids speak in their families? Which language are they or like what language do they use in school or learn in school?
Okay, I forgot to say that, but people, they speak Spanish and they are not very used to in learning another language. And parents, that's one of the biggest problems. But parents, they don't make their children to use the language, the Tehuelche language. You know? They pretend that I should do that, but they don't do it themselves. No? not because they don't want, but because they feel afraid, or because of linguistic insecureness, and it's not easy for them to do that, no? But they don't insist on that.
I was wondering if Serena also wanted to know whether they have Tehuelche lessons in school, maybe.
No, they don't.
No. Okay.
No,
right.
no.
Thank you. The second is from Edmund Kane. I'll just read it, it's maybe quicker. Considering the situation on the one hand and the common accounts that being bilingual is a cognitive advantage, do you think we need to re-evaluate such general accounts? Where should we draw a line that being bilingual starts to work?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
If you read it in the chat.
Yes, consider the situation on the common accounts that being bilingual is a cognitive. Oh, yes. Oh, well, I think we should ask ourselves what does it mean to be bilingual? What does it mean to use another language? I do think that these people use the language, but they use the language in a very particular way, and that's why anthropology comes. We need to do an ethnography before and to see which are their interest in the language. For instance, for these people, the Tehuelche language means a way of being recognized as Tehuelche. So they only need they need, that's a lot of them. They need linguistic tokens that may help them to reivindicate a Tehuelche identity. If we insist on them learning a language as they should speak, because they should be bilingual, well, we're going to face the big frustration there.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question by Sarah Round. Fascinating talk. Can I ask you to elaborate on the conflicts or other tensions between this language community and the Mapuche?
Yes, well, among friends, I would put it this way. The Tehuelches were very nice, they were beautiful, they were kind, and they were tall, but they were distinguished. And the Mapuches, they're ugly, and they're mean, and they are not so interesting. But they are there. Actually, the ideology that the Argentinian government, but 120 years ago, set to invade Patagonia is that we had Chilean Indians that are coming and invading Patagonia, and they're killing our own Indians, which of course it was never true. But this is what we learn in school. This is what people are still learning in school. And so they learned that the Tehuelche was the language of the Patagonia, was spoken in Patagonia. But Patagonia as a region is a creation, is a new creation. And of course we can't say that the language that we are talking about was the same language that it was spoken all through Patagonia, which is a very big territory. We just can't say that but that's not what they want to hear. So a way of the white people of occupying those territories is to saying, okay, the Tehuelches are not here because you killed them, so we're chasing you off. And now the Mapuches are reclaiming their ancestral land, and they use this argument, and they use our linguistic revitalization, I'm saying our because I feel part of it, of the Tehuelche, as an argument to say they're still Tehuelche, so you should leave from here. It's very complicated, and it's especially now it's everything is burning with them there. But yeah, I hope it summarized it, but actually it's not the Tehuelche. This is important to say that the Tehuelche people today, they don't have problems with that ancient conflict, which of course it was invented, it was not like that. They have problems because they feel displaced by this reivindication of the Mapuche. They're much stronger, their language is much stronger and it's still spoken. So whenever we put indigenous people together, Mapuches will speak and they will leave the Tehuelche out, and that's a conflict. And I've seen this conflict in many other communities as well, no? In many other contexts, in Mexico and in Peru. Whenever there's an indigenous community that feels strong, the other one is displaced. That's a problem that they have right now.
It's maybe interesting to look at Serena's question. I see it as a community effort. You must find allies.
Yeah, we do. And that's why the idea is to publish this small book, because as their strategy is to do very, very small things that go from mouth to mouth, from one people to the other one, and they want to let people, the world, know that they are still there. They chose to call this book that we're going to, I hope we will publish, "We Are Still Here," When Ashipek, or "We Are Here," and they know they're getting support from the rest of the community. Yeah, yes, of course.
And may I just add that it is, I just wrote it, but it's a surprise to know that anything indigenous survived in southern Argentina, because the knowledge, the superficial knowledge I had was only people maybe in northern, near Paraguay, Uruguay, Chaco, but not in the south. So maybe very superficial, but it's a good thing. And I
yeah,
there are good.
I must say that there are other communities. The Selknam community, they are organizing themselves and they're relearning their language. The Yaman community, they were called Yamana before, they were the people that Darwin and Fitzroy met. Well, they are learning their language again, and there are other small communities, Kaweska as well. So, yeah.
And if I just take one second, just because I suggested that maybe you go through music and you go through the legends. When you talked about the woman in the wind, sounds like a figure that is in Central America. It's called La Llorona. Maybe it's the same one. And
no.
The tradition, it's not La Llorona. Okay.
No, maybe it was a stupid example.
I might have to stop you here. I'm really sorry. It's really interesting. I have questions myself, but I think I have to stop you here because the next panel is, Rita just wrote us,